The responsibilities of a production designer on a film like Blackhat are really broad. A production as complex as Blackhat, certainly the way that Michael wanted to plan it, meant that I would be working in at least 3 or 4 different countries all over Southeast Asia, as well as here in Los Angeles, and putting together not just the sets, but overseeing locations, any props, any dressing, working with Michael on color schemes that provoke the mood of the scene, working with Michael on research to find out exactly what a lot of these locations should look like. One of the things that makes this particular film so unique from a production design standpoint is the level of realism, I think, that Michael wanted to go into, which was very, very challenging. You know, as a production designer, sometimes we're left to create our own interpretations or statements, especially when it's a film that's more fanciful or science fiction based. But with this needing to be so factual and so correct, it was important for us to do a lot of very heavy research. My journey to production design was very unusual, only because I'm from the southwest of England, a place called Devon. There really isn't any way you can get into the film industry there. But I really didn't want to be a farmer for the rest of my life. So I went to art school in London. I went to Chelsea School of Art, did pretty well, and then went on to the Royal College of Art. I was studying everything from interior design to product design. I didn't really do a film course, although I did help out some of the young budding directors at the Royal College of Art in terms of making props and helping them with dressing and things like that. And I got the bug, but really put it to one side. It was time to grow up, go get a job. So I got a job offer. I went to Japan, I went to Tokyo, and worked for Sony, designing really the last generation of Walkmans and Discmans, and starting on things like the mini disc. So I was busy following my product design career, and to keep myself interested in the evenings, I had an exhibition that was put together based on drawings and models and things I was just making in the evenings in my little tiny Tokyo apartment. At exactly that time, they were doing a huge retrospective on George Lucas's Star Wars and Indiana Jones series in Tokyo. And the art director, curator of that exhibit, happened to wander down the street in the middle of Tokyo, went into this tiny gallery, saw my stuff, and left the famous ILM business card. So I called them up, I got an interview, and I got a job. So I moved to the United States the following year and started my career as a visual effects art director up at ILM. I kind of went back to film school at ILM. So my basis for everything I know about film comes from those old-timers who made all those original Star Wars films. So my first credit was Twister, the 1990s visual effects weather extravaganza. And from there, I ended up segueing into illustration and concept art for many well-known directors and production designers, and very quickly realized production design is what I wanted to do. So from that point, I really started just working hard, working long hours, and trying to climb my way up the ladder until I got my first break. So the film I'd worked on before Blackhat was Inception with Christopher Nolan, and immediately after that I was working on a long-term development project, a film called Robopocalypse for Steven Spielberg, who I'd worked with on Indiana Jones. This project was very deep. It was a book that hadn't been released yet. We were working with a dossier. And so I was buried in this project for several years, having the time of my life working with Steven and his crew. Sadly, that project didn't happen, and it dropped away. So I found myself several years later, having worked year after year after year consistently on films, without anything to show for a couple of years' work. And then I got the call from my agent that there was this really interesting script that Michael Mann was focusing on, and could I perhaps go in for an interview? I was very fortunate on Blackhat because Michael is such a studied researcher himself. I mean, it's extraordinary the amount of work he goes into, I think, before he even starts thinking about staging scenes and plotting specific shots. So when I joined Blackhat, not only had Michael been buried in this script for a very long time, but he'd also created dossiers and photographic imagery that was just delivered to me to work with as a starting point, which was something I'd never experienced before. It was extraordinary. I started with a very small team in Los Angeles at Forward Pass, Michael's production office. Almost immediately, I started working with the locations team, looking at the places that we were going to shoot in Los Angeles. We also started making plans for a huge round trip to some of these amazing foreign places, these exotic locations. You know, I'd been to some of these places before, but obviously not under the guise of looking for seedy places and unusual underground environments. This was something very, very new. I was very rarely out looking for locations on my own. Michael would always want to be there. Flying around with Michael, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes early morning. You know, you're speeding around the harbor of Hong Kong with Michael Mann, with wind in your hair and neon lights. You might as well be in one of his films. But I adopted a really unique style of production design for Michael. He needed a lot of technical equipment and things to help him with his process. So I ended up acquiring over I think the 8 months I was on that film, a utility belt that had absolutely anything that Michael would want. I had in there obviously a compass, I had a Swiss Army knife, I had a flashlight, I had a notepad, I had absolutely everything. I looked like Batman with this thing. But Michael learned that it was there. And if he wanted to, you know, have a light reading, he'd just say, "Hey guy," you know, and I would be able to just grab something and give it to him. And that just became an accepted situation between us. I liked that position. I was always kind of there as his sidekick, you know. It was interesting. I always try on every film to get into the head of the director that I'm working with. At the end of the day, a production designer is there to help craft a look or a feel for a film. But at the same time, there's a level of respect and understanding that you're there being trusted to, I think, forward the vision of that individual. Michael Mann has such a very specific taste and sensibility when it comes to the way somewhere's lit, the feeling you get from that, the music he chooses. He showed me this extraordinary array of photographic reference that he had compiled himself, showing the journey from the beginning of the film right the way through. And the photographs flowed very much in the way that the story does as we see it. He asked me to look at it, come in over the weekend when nobody else was there, and play with it. He said, "Look, these are the boards, these are the photographs. I'd like you to go through them and add and edit what you see. I'd be very interested to see what you do with it." The following Monday, Michael came in, as he does very early, looked at what I had done, and we went through a series of then re-editing it back to what Michael had done, but preserving some of the imagery and ideas that I had put in there. So obviously, I'd gone too far with what I had done to this film, and he was reining it back to the original vision. However, that process was a really good bonding exercise for us both. I think he got to see what my interpretation of the script was in a very free way. But he has this very natural eye for photography. I think in the same way as Stanley Kubrick had, doing his photojournalism. And I think Michael sees things very much in that way. So he would take photographs and then send them to me and say, this is it, this is what we're doing. We would then look at the locations around the clock and photograph them in order to see how those locations changed from day through to night. So we would have a complete record of the sun paths, but also how the lighting changed and how the mood of the space would change. And he would rewrite scenes for different times of day to suit the mood of that particular location. We took the authenticity of the film very, very, very seriously. I know that Chris Hemsworth and some of the other performers underwent some very vigorous training under actual hackers that Michael had found and vetted and got to know and understand. I mean, he had begun this journey, as I'm sure he would explain, not really knowing much about this and had a growing fascination for it, but by the end had become something of an expert on the topic. And a lot of our advisors were from the police force, or they were actual hackers. So we had access to both sides of that. And I think that was important. You know, the story does talk about that sort of inner clash between government organizations of the US and China, and how they're sort of in this competitive situation surrounding the hacker that they're looking for. It was definitely a concern of Michael's and the rest of the team that we were making a film that was about hackers, and that there was going to be a lot of imagery of actors and performers leaning over computers and tapping away on keyboards. That had been done to death in Hollywood. How do we make that different? How do we start to explore different ways to look at that? And this led to some interesting ideas, at least one of which made it into the film. Michael had determined that it would be quite nice to see what it would be like to experience a transparent keyboard and see the fingers moving on that keyboard from the underside. So we ended up having to carefully manufacture an oversized keyboard that we could shoot through from below for a very specific shot. The amount of work and the amount of art direction is very deceptive in a film like Blackhat. And that's a good thing. It means that everything you're looking at feels as though it's 100% real and there. But if we start breaking down the amount of sets and the amount of location augmentation, I think the audience would be absolutely flabbergasted with how much was built. For example, the nuclear power station was a complete build. There's a scene where our characters are making their way across a catwalk inside one of these cooling towers. The control room within the nuclear power station that you see that has the meltdown, that entire room in its pre-burnt out state and post-burnt out state was a build, and it was a lot more extensive than what you saw on the film. There are a lot of corridors and rooms, all absolutely designed to be a facsimile of the real power station. That was extremely important to Michael. The outside of the power station, the way we pulled that off was we had a power station in the deep, deep, deep background, and we used an old set design trick where we couldn't get access to that facility, but we used an adjacent piece of pasture that we rented, and I built a facade and an entryway to that power station that from the camera angle looked as though it was joining the power station, but it wasn't. It was just a set that was, I think, half a mile away or something in the end. There's a wonderful scene in the film where Chris creates some chaos by dropping a truck off a multi-story car park. That building isn't real. We had to build that. That was an empty parking area below. And so we got permission to drop a real truck off of a parking structure into a set. I think it was about 6 stories below. But we only really had one shot at it. So we had to make sure that this truck that was being, or this van rather, that was being pushed off the top was going to land exactly where it needed to. It was a very tense night waiting for this stunt to happen. We took hours and hours to prep it, and then everything just went absolutely to plan. It was wonderful. Of course, when Chris actually enters this space and we see the truck sort of hanging there, that was a complete redress. 2 or 3 weeks later, after we dropped the real truck, we then had to get the real truck out, and then we then had to make a truck that could hang in the right angle so that Chris could just walk past it a second later. The Korean restaurant scene was an interesting one. We'd originally assumed it was going to be a set build because of the action sequence and the fight. However, because of scheduling and because of the fact that we needed to cram so much into our time in Los Angeles, we started to explore the idea of it being a location, and we found one. The restaurant that we found was very much as you see it. We painted the location a very deep red, I think really just to give it a flavor of being somewhere slightly exotic, but also not very sophisticated. The thing that made that location very unique was the doorway at the back that led to the hidden room, where of course Chris finds the computer. And Michael was very specific in not wanting that location to be another place. He wanted it to be a self-contained scene. The smallness of the space, and I would try and guesstimate in memory that the space was probably about 70 feet by 45 feet. So it's not really very big when you fill that with chairs and tables. And then you're going to have 3 or 4 heavies that come in and try to take Chris on. So I was always very, very impressed at how the stunt team worked and how they were able to really come up with these very, very believable fights in limited spaces. We needed a unique and interesting location for a gunfight, set inside a shipping yard with a whole array of shipping containers. Very classic sort of Hong Kong scenario. You can imagine the Bay of Hong Kong with all these sort of shipping containers. And Michael had challenged the location team to go and find something of interest. He wanted something on the water, he wanted shipping containers, but he wanted that extra, just something. And what could it be? We searched for that location tirelessly. It really was the, it was going to be the sort of the, the holy chalice that we had to find in this film. And I remember it because I was very proud and very lucky to be the first person to lay eyes on what would eventually become the huge concrete drainage structure. And I saw it actually from a boat floating around in the Bay of Hong Kong and asked the simple question, what's that huge square hole over there under the road? And I was told categorically, oh no, you don't want to go there. That's the drainage for most of Hong Kong. It was an absolutely massive spillway. And I said, well, could we just kind of float over there and go and have a look? And of course, the answer was no. And then there was some arm twisting. And we finally just went off and climbed up this spillway. And with every step that I took, I got chills. I realized that we'd found this incredibly unique, interesting space that Michael was going to just take and turn into this epic gunfight, which of course he does. The only problem was that there were no shipping containers. So what I had to do was build lightweight shipping containers that could be squibbed so that they received all these bullet holes. It was really the job of Hong Kong to get all of this together, and it was a massive, massive undertaking. But it was well worth it. You'll see it clearly in the film. Definitely the hardest location to find and secure was the Hong Kong safe house. We ended up going almost immediately into a corner building in Old Town Kowloon, which have very specific window frames and tiles on the wall. It's very, very authentic. The place that we found that had the views outside that Michael liked was actually a sort of a massage parlor / brothel. And we initially had thought, well, this is great, but we really don't want to be here. And there was a lot of work to do in this space that you see in the film that's very open. Obviously, it had been divided up into these tiny compartments for whatever it is they do in those compartments. So we went on this incredible search around Hong Kong, trying to find exactly the same apartment, or at least something very similar, which initially seemed very easy because there is a lot of repetitive architecture in Hong Kong when it comes to these apartments from the 1920s, which is, I think, when this building was built. But honestly, after about 85 location hunts, we came back around to deciding that this was the place. So we ended up renting the location, stripping out all of this sordid stuff, and repainting and redesigning the space so that we had bedrooms for our characters, we had the main open space for all of the computer equipment. Most important for Michael were the sight lines out of the windows. And for those who are going to look carefully, you'll notice that there are billboards out of the windows advertising watches and whiskey and things like that. But in this case, it was very important for Michael to have the eyes and the faces of the models looking into the apartment. This is a really nice detail. The thing that made it very difficult was that the billboards that were outside the windows didn't exist at those locations. So a process that would normally take about half a year to get planning permission to build a billboard needed to be condensed into 3 weeks. And that was extremely hard to get permission for in a foreign country. Everything seemed to be nicely tucked away. And then 4 days before Michael was due to arrive with his cast to shoot, I started to realize that the billboards just were not going up, even though I'd been told that we had planning permission. And on a much deeper questioning and almost interrogation of the local locations team, I found out that they hadn't gained planning permission, which was really frightening. So I had to take it upon myself to see that process through, which was extremely stressful. But within 4 days, we had printed a billboard that was, I think, about 100 feet by 65 feet on one side and a slightly smaller one on the other side. And we'd got planning permission for all the neon lights and neon signs that Michael wanted to be lit around the outside. So we made it by the skin of our teeth, but that one was a very scary proposition. Any time you have to involve real world government permissions or property negotiations of any kind, everything slows down. We tend to do things very quickly in the film industry. It's sort of like a fine-tuned military operation. Everything needs to be done efficiently and quickly, but it never is quite that easy once you start involving the real world. You know, I had an incredible team on this film. Tom Rita was the supervising art director on the film, and Tom really was my partner in crime. We traveled the globe together, trying to figure out how we could put together some of these really challenging requests in terms of sets and locations. Victor Zolfo is a legendary set decorator, Oscar-winning set decorator. I'd been wanting to work with Victor for years. Victor was available and very excited to be working with myself on a Michael Mann film. And, in some ways, Victor's job is equally as hard as mine, in that Michael will pour himself into the ins and outs of the decorating. The exchange in particular, I remember, was extremely challenging for Victor and I, because it involved us finding a large atrium space and filling it with these enormous screens. And that was done literally for a nighttime shoot at the drop of a hat. I sometimes am amazed at what Victor was able to pull off. The other people in my art department are really there to service the needs of those three key people, Tom Rita, Victor Zolfo, and myself. They will undertake photographing locations, breaking down the set requirements for each of those spaces, helping create graphics, helping track the set's progress and making sure that we're getting everything we need from construction. And also, I think, liaising a lot with Stuart Dryberg's team on the lighting and making sure that these locations are appropriately lit for the scene. Stuart was phenomenal to talk to. He was always very interested in what the set dressing and the locations were going to be like. It's interesting with lighting. When it comes to sort of key lights and ambient light, obviously that's Stuart's department. But certainly when it comes to, I would call them set dressing lighting, which really neon light falls under that. That was definitely our department's responsibility to put those together. And again, Michael was very, very specific about the colors of the neon. I mean, I never would have imagined this, but he wanted very specific colors to be seen at certain points in the film. There was a very strong work ethic, and the person who worked the hardest on the entire crew was Michael Mann, hands down. I'm not sure he ever slept, really. I know he was viewing dailies in the evenings. He would often call me up quite late night for meetings where we would go over notes, or if he was concerned about a set, he would call me and want to go through that. And, you get on a film like this and you just have to be at his beck and call. That's what's expected. It's a very sort of old school approach to filmmaking. The director is God, and, you need to make sure that he's getting everything that he needs. I personally didn't see any of the dailies, and I'm not sure any of the other crew did, really. I think that was something very much that Michael does solo with his editors. He treats that as a very separate part of his filmmaking process. And quite frankly, we're all so busy running around that there's not really any time other than just sleep. I definitely came away from this film with a stronger understanding of how much of a problem this is for our government agencies. I had no idea. We always tend to think of things in terms of, breaking in. It's just a physical thing that you do. But there is another world that's going on, and another war that's going on continuously around us. It's been many years since I've even thought about Blackhat. As anyone who works in the film industry, you immerse yourself in this world. You barely have time for your own family. You work as a tight-knit movie family, and then you finish the film and you all just go your separate ways, and you may never see those people again. I mean, I'm very lucky I've seen Michael a couple of times, but a lot of those people you never see again, and there's always something very melancholy and sad about that moment. You sort of return back to your normal life where everyone's going about their business, and you've done crazy things like fly around in a helicopter or go 80 miles an hour in the Bay of Hong Kong in a speedboat with Michael Mann in the middle of the night, or, watched a gunfight in a spillway. You do all these crazy things and then you go home to your normal life. It's a very strange feeling that you end up with at the end of these films. But it is nice to sit here and reminisce about it. I have very fond memories, lots of lessons that I learned from Michael that I carried on to other productions that I worked on. So, it's very funny for me that I was asked back here to talk about Blackhat. Very nice experience.